So I'm really big on conversations to do with masculinity that focus and center intersectionality. Now, we're going to get into what intersectionality is in this episode. We're not going to go too deep or too academic or too conceptually dense, but the aspect that I want to focus on in this episode is really this overarching assumption that often occurs in masculinity discourse, but also in masculinity work, that positions boys, young men, men as a monoliths, as a singularity when it comes to experiences, articulations, and embodiments of masculinity. And for me, intersectionality is a beautiful tool to be able to not only critique this assumption, but to build conversations, interventions, reflections, and ideas relating to masculinity that aren't rooted in this focus on the singularity or the assumption, rather, of the singularity. So for me, when I'm speaking to people about masculinity, when I'm talking to educators about masculinity, when I'm talking to young people about masculinity, I'm being really clear with them from the jump that I am not making an assumption about what it means to be you. I'm not making an assumption that I've got what you are experiencing, what makes you you. I'm not making the assumption that I've got it figured out. Because often what happens in conversations and consequential interventions relate into masculinity is that we associate or we approach, sorry, this conversation, this intervention with the assumption we know what we need to do, we know what your experience is, and we know how to help. For me, that is something that can really place and often does place really big barriers to congruent, authentic communication and really personal learning experiences for any masculinity involved in the space, whether it's a young masculinity in school, whether it's a teen, whether it's a young man, wherever the masculinity is situated, that can place those barriers to real authentic communication and reflection. And so I use intersectionality a lot in my work because for me, intersectionality really speaks to the plurality of human experience. It really seeks to explore and examine the ways in which aspects of our identity often overlap, how they combine, how they interact with each other to produce either experiences of privilege or experiences of marginalization or oppression. And the scholar, the genius mind behind this framing of intersectionality is Kimberly Crenshaw. And a lot of our understanding of not just the plurality of human experience, but most specifically, how those experiences interact and communicate and compound individually and uniquely comes from Kimberly Crenshaw's genius. And for me, what I think is really useful from that idea and that concept and that reality of intersectionality, what's really useful from that, framing is how that applies to the experience of masculinity, how that applies to the articulation and the embodiment of masculinities in spaces that we may work with young people, young masculinities, young men, men in general. Because often, as I've said, there is this assumption that when we're speaking to masculinity, we're speaking to a universal monolith experience. All men think this, all men do this, all men behave this way, all men think this, and all men have this response in this context, and all men experience masculinity in this way. Which, when we say it like that, commonsensically, we might arrive at the conclusion of, well, of course, that's not the case. But often in the discourse and often in the framing of the conversation, that is the energy that is brought into the space. So what intersectionality allows us to do is it allows us to contact plurality. And I'll give you an example of what this looks like for me in action and what I see across my work in different spaces across the UK, in different parts of the UK where different cultures and communities exist and coexist together in spaces, and how that impacts and influences articulations and embodiments of masculinity. I often use the example of the manosphere as a way of looking at the singularity or the monolith in action. Often, when you speak to people about what do you think we need to do about masculinity, they will often name the manosphere or red pill or the online sphere something that is impacting and grossly affecting young people, specifically young men and masculinities. And that's not saying that that isn't true or that isn't something that we need to focus on. But one of the things that I've learned and really championed in my work over the years is that pressingness, that experience, that influencing factor on masculinity, that pertinence isn't always the same for different masculinities from different cultural backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds, different racial backgrounds, as an example. For example, when I speak to young people racialized as black and brown, they will often frequently share with me, I'm less interested or influenced by the manosphere. That's not something that impacts and influences me. I can look at that and know that for me, that doesn't speak to my experience of masculinity. That doesn't speak to my experience of what it means to be a man. But what I do want to talk about, Lewis, is how I'm navigating racism in school right now, how I'm navigating prejudice right now, how when I step out of school, I'm stopped and searched quite frequently, if I'm being honest and being real. What's impacting me is how I'm seen in my community, by people, and how that is often racialized. And that's my paraphrase. But this acute awareness of manosphere talk doesn't really speak to my experience of masculinity. But when we're speaking about racialization, we're speaking about race, when we're speaking about racism, that speaks to my experience. You want to talk about adultification and how I'm adultified constantly in this space, and how teachers and people in the community view and see me as a grown adult, even though I'm 13 years old. Let's talk about that, because that's impacting my masculinity. That's impacting how I think I need to present in the space. And that's also impacting how people treat me. That's one example of how an intersectional lens doesn't make the assumption that manosphere red pill is the focus point for all masculinities in all different spaces. Now, to be clear, that is not me saying that that aspect of the online sphere doesn't need to be addressed. It absolutely does. But what intersectionality allows you to do is move beyond broad assumptions and root yourself in the worlds of the young people that you're working alongside, that you're in proximity to, that if you're an educator watching this podcast, you're serving and looking after. And I think that's really important in our reflections and articulations. And intersectionality isn't just about the intersections between race and politics and current events. We're talking about things like sexuality. We're talking about things like neurodivergence, which is something, again, that is often not acknowledged. And that intersectionality, again, of race, neurodivergence, and experience of masculinity is something that gets quite complex. Because think about it like this. How many young people do you work with or have you heard from about this idea that I'm always seen as disrespectful, I'm always seen as disengaged, I'm always seen as distracted, I'm always seen as this person that, is likely to get in trouble, I'm always seen as the troublemaker? But often one of the questions I ask educators in that space when I work with these young people and I sit down with them and we have a conversation and we explore ideas of masculinity, what becomes abundantly clear in that space is that this young person isn't, just disengaged, distracted, and disrespectful. There's likely within that presentation a unacknowledged learning need. In some spaces, that might actually be some form of unacknowledged neurodivergence. But that unacknowledged neurodivergence is racialized, and it is brought into the context of conversation is seen as an individual character defect instead of a learner need in the context of education. That's what intersectionality allows you to do. It allows you to see context, but also recognize where bias, prejudice, and an overarching assumption often takes place. And when I'm speaking to and about masculinity, this is something that I speak about without a doubt most frequently. Boys, men, masculinities are not monoliths. We do not experience our gendered experience, what it means to be a man, the same across the board. We might have shared aspects of experience, but they're not the same from man to man to man. And again, this might seem commonsensical, but in some of the conversations that I'm seeing, in some of the takes that I'm seeing around masculinity, there are broad, blanket assumptions about what it means to be a man that are bypassing the granularity of intersectionality. And to say that in a way that doesn't sound like I'm trying to just rhyme everything that ends with itty, right? We're bypassing the individuality or the meaning of what it means to be a man and experience masculinity in boys, men that we engage with, that we serve in the educational context, so that we might be holding space for in the community. And that's important to me, because intersectionality is something that we all have. We're not just gendered as men. We are men in proximity to class identity. We are men in proximity to race or racialization. We are impacted and influenced by our culture. We are impacted and influenced by our learning needs and our learning requirements. We are impacted and influenced by perhaps a disability that we may have that's either visible or not so visible. We are impacted and influenced by the proximity that we have to faith or belief systems that we've learned and that we've been raised within. These all impact and influence how we embody and express our masculinity. And that is important to name because we're not monolith experiences. We're not a singularity. There is difference, and that difference in conversations around masculinity matters. Because if we're going into spaces and we're trying to implement interventions, we're trying to create space for rich learning environments, but also, where necessary, holding mirrors to experiences that allow people to reflect on who they are and how they might change aspects of who they are, how they might work on aspects of who they are. We have to get the cultural context right. We have to get this experience that surrounds the embodiment of masculinity. We have to see it. We have to acknowledge it. We have to center it. And for me, what intersectionality allows us to do is to be more attuned to that, to be more aware of how experiences might be similar at the surface level, but when you start digging deep into those um, intersections, you start exploring proximity to different strands of lived experience, racialization, culture, faith, sexuality, disability, etc., then you start really beginning to understand the masculinities in the room and how they've been constructed and how they are constructing themselves at this point in time. We can't allow room or create room rather for transformation without first giving space for men, masculinities, young men, teen boys to come in and exist as they are. And what intersectionality allows us to do is to explore that in as much depth and detail as we can, or as much depth and detail as we can sort of extract or encourage to be reflected in these spaces. Because sometimes that awareness isn't there and that comes with time. But bypassing intersectionality at the expense of this perceived singularity is preventing deeply personal, deeply transformative learning experiences. And I want to speak to that because it's something, again, I don't see discussed enough in conversations that relate to experiences of masculinity. And if we want to create room, because often what I hear, and this is maybe a bit of a sidetrack, but often what I hear is that, we need to first listen to boys to be able to understand what they need. And we need to be able to hear them. We need to listen to them. I agree. But we need to be able to do it in a way that also holds the mirror to some of our biases and assumptions. I can't tell you the amount of times when I started my career, I would walk into a room with an assumption of who I was working with and what had brought them into the space. And every single time I did that, I was figuratively slapped across the face multiple times by my own assumptions, my own bias, and my own stereotyping. And what's wild and rich about that is that I understand what that's like to be stereotyped, to be sort of looked at and assumed this is who you are, this is what you bring into the space. We do it as human beings. We do it all the time. To quote one of my mentors and one of the people that I love and respect dearly in this work and outside of this work as well, Aisha Thomas, our brains are wired for efficiency, not always for equity. And I think that's something that really applies to our blanket assumptions in conversations around masculinity. We're wired for the assumption, the singularity, the sort of this is what it is, broad stroke. But when it's time to get into the granularity, we're like, oh, no, I didn't. Yeah, it's complex. Of course, it's complex. This whole intersection, masculinity alone, is incredibly complex. It's why I've written a book on it and essentially said, this is way more complex than we're ever really ever paying attention to. But instead of pretending like that's not the case and trying to create as sort of broad a brush as possible, let's really refine and get deep into context. And for me, intersectionality allows us to do that. So if you listen to this episode and you're thinking to yourself, okay, how do I go about doing this? What does this look like in context? For me, I always like to create room for young people to articulate and explore and expand on who they are and how they show up in the space. I like them to really think about and explore. And in some of my sessions, I make time for thinking about those different intersections. Sometimes I'll have them up on the board. Sometimes I'll have them in conversation. Sometimes I'll have it out as handouts and just getting us to think about how important are these things for you? What do you rank as most important? What do you rank as least important? How is that impacting and influencing you today? How is that impacting and influencing you, this week? This type of conversation that's rooted into the real of the experience, because we don't give young people the opportunity to explore and expand the intricacies of who they are. How can we expect them to have the self-awareness to be able to articulate and, where necessary, metabolize, and where necessary, really build those aspects of masculine identity, but also masculinity for them that feels deeply personal and congruent? So I'm gonna leave that one there for now because I feel like I'm about to go out into a bit of a rant and rant at you for the next 45 minutes. But for me, I've been thinking about intersectionality a lot, specifically this week. And as I said, I talk about a lot of my work, but it's something that's been coming up at the time of recording a lot in my work and also a lot in the spaces that I've been holding and facilitating. And I wanted to share some of my thoughts as they're landing right now. They might feel messy, they might feel a little bit all over the place, but if you're new here, you know that that's how we roll sometimes. Not every platform needs to be incredibly polished and, perfectly succinct. Sometimes there needs to be space for those ideas to be landing in a way that aspects might hit you, aspects might go, yeah, actually, and others you might go, whoa, what's going on here? Sometimes I find that to be the best space for ideas to really, fester and build and season, for lack of a better term. So I'm gonna leave the episode there. Thank you so much for your time. Intersectionality for me is massively important and it will continue to be important. And if you want to find out some more about some of my thoughts about plurality and intersectionality, I've written a little bit about it in my book, Masculinities in Schools, and I often talk about it a lot across my social media channels as well, which is just at Lewis Wedlock, wherever you kind of get your social media fix from. So yeah, that's that for this episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate you, and I will see you in a future episode very, very soon. Big blessings to you.